That is a highly controversial topic.
It's not quite moral, but it is a theological explanation.
The idea of like apocalyptic literature is not that it's to be interpreted in necessarily a literal sense.
Yeah, I'm impressed by your very thorough research.
I just started thinking about this because, as you might imagine, nobody's ever asked me in church about Judaism.
That's a fascinating philosophical discussion.
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe. Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today my guest is Rabbi Jeffrey Falick of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in Metro Detroit. Thank you for joining us, Rabbi.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for asking me to be part of this.
You were raised Jewish, I assume. Which denomination?
My family were, like a lot of American Jews of the 60s and 70s and 80s, we were basically secular Jews, but we were members, when we were members, of Reform temples. So I guess that's the denomination. And then as I got older and more interested in community and my Jewish identity, I pursued my activities in the Reform movement. I felt that was closest to my belief system, at least at the time. And that's where I was educated as well after university. I went to the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion for 5 years to become a rabbi.
Whenever I'm dealing with a religion with which I'm not all that familiar, the first legitimizing question I ask is, are you allowed to conduct weddings? So, are you allowed to conduct weddings?
By virtue of both having been ordained as a Reform rabbi, and I still pay my dues to the Reform organization because they're good people and they supported me through some things, and by virtue of being a humanistic rabbi, which is definitely a legitimate and recognized movement, I can do weddings anywhere I'm permitted to, or in the states that require extra paperwork, I qualify there too.
Prior to being a secular humanistic rabbi, you were a rabbi in the Reform Judaism tradition. What led you to becoming a rabbi?
So first, it's important to understand that, for most Jews, Judaism is much more than a religion. It has components of ethnicity. It has components of ancient tribalism, of what we call peoplehood. So when I say I grew up as a Reformed Jew, I also dabbled in many other places. I went to a number of conservative congregations. I should always say, because I always do, that conservative Judaism is the worst named religious movement in the history of religious movements, because they're the conservative. They are not. they're sort of the conservative reformers. But I liked them a lot at the time. I always liked tradition and ritual. And but when it came to deciding what the place of Jewish law was going to be in my life, at that time, having grown up in the Reform movement and respecting their social justice agenda and their position on that, that's what I chose as my rabbinical education. It just seemed to be the better fit for me. Reform Judaism essentially holds that people have autonomy over their own decision making when it comes to Jewish law. At least when it comes to ritual law. How they parse that is really complicated, and you could fill books up, and they have, with that. But that was, for me, of the different expressions of my Jewishness, that one was the one that felt the most both familiar and also the most honest at the time. But even after I became a Reform rabbi, I dabbled in a lot of others, and eventually, for a variety of reasons, including the reasons that I was a closeted gay man married to a woman, I actually did what a lot of such people do, and I chose to go into a more traditional route and stayed there for a little while too. So I've kind of been all over the place Jewishly. Nothing really fit until I discovered Humanistic Judaism. And in fact, I never worked as a movement rabbi. I worked at two Hillel foundations, as we used to call them, the student campus Jewish organizations. I was a director at University of Illinois and the University of Miami. And I also worked as the assistant executive director at a large Jewish community center where I did all kinds of programming, some of it Jewish, some of it general and cultural, much of it related to secular Judaism or secular expressions or manifestations of Judaism. And it wasn't until I got into this movement and a position happened to open up that I found the congregational rabbinate, and this would turn out to be a good fit for me.
Now, I could answer this one for myself, and I've had to answer it several times in my life. But I'll ask you, without God, how can there be ethics?
Well, I think if God actually were the source of our ethical decision making, we'd be in a lot of trouble, because clearly the religions of the world, even denominations within the religions of the world, have very, very little capacity to come to any agreement about what's ethical or moral. So I think we can pretty much lay that on the table, that the supernatural does not really serve as a great authority for ethical and moral decision making. And humanistic Judaism, though you and I defined it yet, is a non-theistic sort of Jewish approach to religiosity, I guess you'd say. Plenty of secular Jews in the world, not all of them are involved in our movement. But I think most Jews, at least that I know, whether they're involved in a Reform congregation or a conservative congregation, I think they know that the foundation of ethics is basically, I think it's rooted in human dignity, in human happiness or thriving, some might say, human survival, which includes global awareness for the planet and all the things that we are interdependent with. So while it is humanism, I don't want to get trapped in the idea that we are completely selfish about the pursuit of this. The selfishness comes in taking care of and preserving the whole planet. The foundation of ethics, as I said, is clearly cannot be God, because the various religions of the world never agree. In fact, they fiercely disagree. They have fought wars over what particular religion and the ethics of what religion take precedence over, etc. There are Christians in the world today that are arguing that gay marriage and gay identity and so forth, LGBT rights and so forth, are the essence of morality and ethics, that we must recognize that. Of course, I agree with that. But we have equally large numbers of Christians in the world that are saying it's the greatest sin that you could possibly imagine and stay away from it. And it indicates a complete abdication of morality. So if they're both, and this is Christians, if they're both somehow basing this on, I don't know, some supernatural authority, whatever it is, Jesus's words or God's or whatever, they have some really big, serious communication and interpretation issues. So if that certainly can't be it. I hope I answered that as fully as possible, because we could talk about that, of course, for weeks.
So what is God to you? And in relation to that, what is sin versus virtue?
Well, I suppose that, let me start with sin versus virtue, because sin is one of those words that even in Judaism, we don't use it the same way that Christians use it. I'm not as expert in Islam as I am in Christianity, but I understand it to be similar there. It's not a, sort of a state of being, a sinful person. Judaism, regardless of the religious or the secular variety, always recognizes the complexity of human beings and the fact that we have what we would call in Hebrew, you call it a yetzer hara, a yetzer hatov. It's basically an impulse to do that which is right, an impulse to sort of follow your own way without maybe considering morality. And both of them, that's a balanced human being. I recently wrote an article about Star Trek. I got a lot of my humanism, a lot of it was inspired by Star Trek. And there was this wonderful episode way back when called The Enemy Within, where Kirk split in two and became both things. He was the ultimate sinful, non-virtuous person and the wonderful kind. And it didn't work out too well for Split Kirk. They had to throw him back in the transporter and make him into one person again. So that's about as much as I want to say about sin and virtue. Virtuous behavior, I think, is pursuing a moral and ethical course to the best of your ability, with all of the evolutionary and psychological obstacles that we have to deal with as human beings that arose from that. Now, the first part of the question, what do I think about God? I think he is an interesting and varied character in human literature and Jewish literature. There's a wonderful new book, and I'm going to mess up the author's name, so I'm only going to give the title of it, God and Anatomy, which talks about how in the days of writing the Jewish scriptures, at least, we were talking about a very anthropomorphic kind of God, a God with a body, a God that could look very strange to certain people who saw him. And that was very much a version of Yahweh or El that was prevalent in those days. And then we moved to a hidden God, and that has all kinds of desires and so forth. We have gods that demand this and gods that demand that. Deities are products of the human imagination. And that doesn't mean they don't carry with them sometimes important lessons, because people use deities as ways of conveying lessons about things. So one can certainly look at a story if there's a good moral lesson to it, whether it's in the Torah or some other Jewish or religious or the really international global religious literature. If the gods are acting there and there's some kind of wonderful lesson that arises from it, well, yay. That means that they had stumbled, those who wrote it, wrote these things, they had stumbled upon some good lessons, as we would expect. We're not the first people who have grappled with ethics and morality. And in so doing, they converted that to legend. That would be, I suppose, a wonderful method of transmission for them. That said, there's a lot of awful crap that both Yahweh, who is which is the formal name, as far as we know, of the God of the Israelites and subsequently the Jews. There's a lot of crap that he does, and he is a he. I've argued with people about this a lot. I tell them, look, if you need to believe in God, and I respect that belief, and that requires a sort of a degendering, I totally respect that, but please don't tell me that the God of the Torah does not have male characteristics. He absolutely has male characteristics. So it's a fictional being. It's a fictional deity, like every other deity that we've ever invented. So many atheists have said before me, if you think about the hundreds of gods that you don't believe in, just take it one step further and you'll know what it means to be me and other people who are non-theists. It's just one more God we don't believe in. Doesn't mean we don't respect what the literature can say when it says it well and says it in a way that's useful for us. But we don't refer to our literature, I say scripture because that's what most people call it. We don't refer to our ancient or other literature, or interpretive literature, looking for the answers. As humanists, we know where to look for the answers. What we look at it is to see different takes on it, different ways that they understood it, nuances, whether we agree or disagree. It's sort of an historical exploration of the development of morality.
During my conversation with Rabbi Edery in episode 37, he pointed out that Judaism was more than a religion, but a civilization with language and culture. Yet, even now, his statement would be controversial within the community. How do you handle other Jewish people telling you that you're not Jewish enough?
So, actually, there is a pretty fair consensus among most Jews, and I'm talking about almost all Jews, about the nature of what it is to be Jewish. As far as, and in fact, the ultra-Orthodox, the very Orthodox, those who are committed to Jewish law, I suppose, in the conservative movement too, the way into Judaism is to be born to a Jewish mother. That's it. That's how you become Jewish. And by most authorities, it's impossible to become un-Jewish. You can't really leave it. You can sin, you can be sort of not formally excommunicated in the Catholic sense, but shunned in a community, but you're not going to stop being Jewish. You'll be a Jew who sinned. I suppose I'm a Jew who sins, but as some of my more tolerant Orthodox friends say, but all Jews sin. Everybody sins, everybody transgresses, everybody in Judaism, the word sin is actually derived from, or in English, it's derived from the Hebrew word chet, which means to miss the mark. So if you're looking at that way, I suppose the word sin's not so bad. I tend to avoid it because of the English connotations. But transgressing or, walking over the line or way over the line. So I don't know that there's really that much of a disagreement over who is a Jew from the perspective of the belonging to the Jewish people. There is a lot of disagreement over whether or not it should only be the mother that determines, whether or not there should be alternative ways to join other than those that are set aside by Jewish law that require complete adherence to the mitzvot, to the commandments, or complete adherence, and complete adherence to a certain ritual standard to join. But if you're born into it, by all lights, if your mother was Jewish, you're Jewish. Now, in our movement, we don't require that your mother or father be Jewish. And if you want to join up, it's really a matter of committing to being part of the Jewish people. We're actually taking the older approach, because back in the days of the Israelites and the Judahites, that's really what you did. You just joined up. We are like other ancient peoples in that sense. And humanistic Judaism is kind of a throwback that way. The Reform movement determined that formal conversion is required, but if your father was Jewish and not your mother, and in both cases, if you were raised in the Jewish community, they don't really care from which parent comes your descent. And the Orthodox world, of course, very strict, very narrow. But again, if you're born Jewish, they can't throw you out. Now, there is some reality to the fact that people will say, I'm not a rabbi. They'll say that about Reform rabbis, conservative rabbis, Reconstructionist rabbis. Orthodox rabbis will say that from time to time about each other. I've heard that from the ultra-Orthodox, what we call the Haredi side, and some of the more liberal passages or places where Orthodox Judaism is practiced. And they may say that our way of doing Judaism is completely illegitimate, but we know they're wrong because we have a much broader historical perspective on what is Jewish about our lifestyles. And most Reform Jews understand this. Conservative Jews learn a good history of Judaism in the same way. Many Orthodox Jews certainly accept and understand this, even if they are personally bound to Jewish law. So my colleague was not wrong defining us as a civilization. That term was popularized by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan in the mid-1930s in a groundbreaking book that he wrote called Judaism as a Civilization. Now, there's a lot to critique in that book, half of which is a critique of the other movements. He was the founder of the Reconstructionist approach. In fact, that's what he was doing. He was trying to reconstruct Jewish civilization. It didn't become a movement until almost 4 decades after he wrote the book, and that was really more the work of his son-in-law. But he was trying to reconstruct an understanding of being Jewish that surpassed religion. We had sort of gotten into this idea as Americans that Judaism is a religion because that's how Americans talk about their whatever it is about them that contains faith issues. That's how we divide things up. We're very, very rigid about race and all the things that come with that. And we know how that works, of course. And we're very rigid about, what a religion is, but we don't really understand what to do with an ancient people that started as a tribal Mesopotamia or Western Asian nation and went through and was there alongside of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Romans and everybody else. They don't really know what to do with that. And for, I think, comfort's sake and just making our way in the world, Jews began to also use the language of religion. Synagogues certainly had a lot to do with that. In America, the synagogue is the single largest Jewish institution. It still is. And it's one of the reasons that humanistic Jews chose that template to express our Jewish identities. But it's far more complex than a religion. I'm not to in any way denigrate Christianity or Islam, but those are clearly religions. Those are sets of dogmas and beliefs. And I understand there are denominations with them that, as I mentioned earlier, we are not a set of dogmas and beliefs. An atheist Jew who walks into the ultra-Orthodox synagogue, the Chabad Center, which is you may be familiar with, a very outwardly focused, very outreach-oriented towards the Jewish community organization, but Haredi Judaism, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, nevertheless, if I walk in there, they don't ask me what my beliefs are. They ask me if I'm Jewish. And the assumption is your mother Jewish? My mother was 1,000% Jewish, and her mother was, and her mother was, as far as we understand, going way back to when nobody would have claimed they were Jewish unless they were Jewish, because there wouldn't have been no advantage to that whatsoever in the places that they lived. So will they count me in the number of men necessary for constituting the quorum, the minyan? Absolutely. They absolutely will. They might not invite me to make the blessing over the Torah, but that's okay. I don't want to make it anyway.
Do you have a favorite passage from Scripture?
I don't have a favorite passage per se. I do study the Bible a lot. The reason I study is because of the most ancient Jewish literature. I have favorite sections of the Torah in particular, but also some of the other books. I have a particular affinity for Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. There's a lot of presumed humanism there, and some of the pieties that occur at the end were added there, but it's a very this-worldly point of view. I enjoy the stories in the Torah that reveal themselves in one way or another to have been the product of more than one school of thought. I sort of got into my interest in the Bible when, as a teenager, I remember I was asked to give a Devar Torah, a little sermonette about the passage that we read in the autumn about Noah's Ark. It was a very problematic story in any case. Theologically, I don't teach it to children, etc. But my big issue was this is a simple story. It's so simple that we do inappropriately teach it to children all the time, and we make toys and children's books and so forth. Why can't I understand it? Why isn't it in plain? Forget about plain English. Why isn't it in plain Hebrew? And later I learned why. I learned that there were two different sources. There were two similar stories that, as opposed to what they would sometimes do, which is to put one on top of the other or to have a repetition later on, they did this to them. They did an interlinear editing job, really a classical cut and paste job. And when I learned that and saw how it could be separated, which you can access this stuff anywhere. Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible, I think has Noah in there. Then you realize you're talking about two completely different stories with two different worldviews, two different understandings of the deity. And so those are the things that I get excited about. So I actually, for a humanistic rabbi, I teach a lot of Bible.
The Noah story always intrigued me, especially the part where he gets drunk and passes out with his genitals exposed and his youngest son sees him. And
that one, even knowing the sources, remains a little bit obscure. We're clearly looking at one older source, the J source, and one slightly later source. In terms of Judaism, it was slightly later, but a few hundred years later, the P source, the priestly text, and they have different emphases. If you ever wondered why there's seven animals here, two animals there, was it 150 days? Was it 40 days? Did it end with a rainbow? Did it end with a sacrifice? Well, you'll know after you study it from this perspective. It's pretty darn clear, and every academic student of the Bible knows this.
You still gather at the same time as other Jewish congregations. You have an Ark with the Torah.
We do not have an Ark with the Torah.
We were looking through the pictures and couldn't find one, so we just assumed it was there.
Some of there are sister congregations in our movement that do have an Ark with the Torah. My colleagues always put other literature in it too. I guess their congregants were more comfortable with that. We don't have an Ark with the Torah. We keep our Torah in the library.
Because from what I can tell, you're still going through all the motions. One of the things I like about being an atheist is that I don't have to do anything.
You don't have to do anything as a humanistic Jew either. I think that there's a human propensity, probably cultural at this point. I think we can safely say that we like to gather and find ways to reinforce our values. There has always been a sort of a tug of war among humanists. So there were the secular humanists, who I guess we could say they were more the ones we would have called atheists at the time. I am an atheist. There's no question I'm an atheist. I'm also an agnostic. Even Richard Dawkins said he's to use the Yiddish, a Pexels agnostic. You can't know what you don't know, but you can base your actual life on what you can know. And I feel very strongly there's no God acting in our world. So I'm going to take the atheist route. Even though, of course, I'll be open to it. Look, if God comes to Earth, maybe Ezekiel mode or Jesus mode or whatever mode that happens, I'll reconsider. I think every atheist would say that. I heard Richard Dawkins once say that. So, but why do we gather? I think that the desire for human beings to come together to collectively explore values is a very, very powerful and can be a very positive impulse in our societies. There has been, over the last, I would say probably 10 to 15 years, what Sherwin Wine, the founder of our movement, did, and what others have attempted, and some are doing with more or less success, to put together what we would call a movement of congregational humanism. Now, a lot of so-called religious humanism is a little bit more similar to what my Reform, and some conservative too, but more Reform friends do, which is to sort of take all of the the forms of Judaism, including the language, including all the rituals, and to find ways in which they are metaphors for the values and so forth. You know, I think there's at some point where poetry just has to be acknowledged as poetry. And when the poetry is, "Dear God, heal me," it's not really poetry anymore. So we actually don't do what the other Jews do. Our service is unrecognizable to them. It consists of sometimes passages from ancient Jewish or medieval Jewish literature when they work. You know, if there's a passage that says how good it is when people come together, well, yeah, that's pretty not controversial. And it makes a good song, and we enjoy singing in Hebrew a little bit and in English and sometimes in Yiddish, because these are parts of our identity and parts of our history and heritage, not because they're holy or special in any way other than the way that they're special to us, the way that, you know, your grandparents' language may be special to you if you held on to it or what have you. But we are basically disconnected completely from Jewish liturgy, as it were. There's no prayers, there's no mentions of God. The songs that we have, if they're based on something that was once theistic and we like the song, sometimes we'll rewrite it or we'll just take the lines out that make no sense. You can sing about how great it is to come together on Shabbat, the Sabbath, and feel that sense of camaraderie, and leave out the part that says that thanks God for giving it to us, because we know better. We know if anybody gave the Sabbath to us, it was us, we who gave the Sabbath to ourselves. So it's a nice thing. We don't obviously observe Jewish law. We certainly have, we just got past Passover, right? So we certainly have a Seder. And our Seder is shaped very similarly. In my case, I wrote one. I liked the design, the way the book was put together. You know, it's called a Seder because that word means order, and there are things, ways of telling the story in order. Most of what's in the traditional Seder is not in my Seder. I mean, first of all, there's 4,000 pages of praising God, which absolutely, you excise those right away. I replace those with 2 pages of educated conjecture about the archaeological foundations of the origins of the Israelite people and whether or not there's any basis for any Egyptian sojourn to have taken place. There is a little here and there. There's a lot you can say about ancient Israel. It's nothing like what the story is. So instead, we talk about it as a legend. Here's this legend. Our people told this legend. They cared a lot about freedom. It inspired the whole world. What are we going to learn from this legend? On a Friday night, which is, you know, the traditional time that some Jews get together, the bigger service in most Orthodox congregations is undoubtedly Saturday, not Friday night. But Reformed Jews, Conservative Jews, Friday night's big. And so we do get together. We grew out of Reformed Judaism. Our founder was a Reformed Jew. So that was a time when people were gathering, when he founded the movement in the 60s. And we light Shabbat candles, but we talk about their symbolism, and we sing about their symbolism as bringing light into our room and reminding us of the light that we can bring into the world. We certainly don't say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," the Shema Yisrael, which every Jew knows. In fact, sometimes I feel a little guilty that I didn't at least teach it to the kids in our education program. I'm considering doing that just so they'll know. So when their friends tease them, "You don't even know the Shema," which everybody knows, at least they'll know that, but they'll know it from a more critical point of view. Let's put it that way. So we don't say that. Instead, we sing something that our founder wrote that's a little bit more universal to our services. My services have included everyone from Robert Ingersoll, readings from him, to, I hope you know who he is. Yes. Of course, Darwin. There's some great little passages in Darwin. Dawkins, I know he's on everybody's cancel list because he's not been terribly sensitive to some issues about women and trans people and so forth. But he did say some wonderful things about the sort of the chance, the fortunate position we find ourselves in as humans, that we have this ability. But my favorite is Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a secular and humanistic Jew. In fact, he was working, I understand, on a Haggadah, the book he used during the Seder before he died. I'm acquainted with his daughter. We haven't met in person. She was supposed to come in April of 2020, but I've interviewed her, and we've had several discussions together. She's a lovely person. I shouldn't say many. We're not dear friends, but she's somebody I respect and I've learned from. Her mom is one of my idols. Carl Sagan, I think, was one of the better. Was one of the best articulators of popular science and also its connection to our spiritual lives. And by spiritual, I don't mean spirits, I mean the human spirit. I think we can all agree that there is something called the human spirit. So in that sense, I'm that. So that's what we do in our services. Services are really short because when you cut out all that other crap, all we're left with is about 25, 30 minutes. There's a section for well wishes. With a song that we adapted that other people know, but our words are different. There's a section for remembering people. There is a Jewish tradition of remembering people on the anniversary of their death. So all that is there recognizably. But when we get to the time when people would say the Kaddish, which is considered the Jewish prayer for the dead, it's not really. It's really a never-ending series of praises of God. We instead talk about the importance of ennobling humans and of learning about life through its fragility. We say it in English too, so people can understand it. So these forms and rituals, to the extent that, and there are rituals that we practice, have all been repositioned. In that sense, I kind of think we're a little bit more honest and maybe a little bit more true to ancient Judaism, because when the rabbis composed these things, they meant them. Now, maybe they had, some metaphorical pieces there too, but I think they meant them. And I think we alone among the Jewish movements that at least practice something congregationally, we actually mean all the things we say. We say what we mean and we mean what we say.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Falick for speaking with me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're very welcome.
Here's the thing. I really enjoy learning the origins of cliches. Horatio Nelson was a British naval officer who fought in the American Revolutionary War on the British side. He was known for his valor and leadership, but was still unemployed after the war. Then the French Revolutionary War started, and in the chaos, England had a chance to claim some land. Nelson was in the campaign to capture Corsica, where he was successful, but was wounded and lost sight in his eye. Years later, in yet another campaign against England's neighbors, Nelson commanded the HMS Elephant among the fleet assaulting Copenhagen in Denmark. The battle wasn't going well, and Nelson was given the order to withdraw via semaphore. He then put the telescope up to his blind eye and declared, "I really do not see the signal." This is where we get the term, turning a blind eye to something. Here's another thing related to word origins. A spinster is an unmarried woman who is older than the age range that's usually expected for a woman to be married. It's synonymous with old maid. It generally has a negative connotation, and there's no real male equivalent. I suppose confirmed bachelor comes closest. But why spinster? The term has been used for over 400 years. It comes from prior to the Industrial Revolution, where wool was put on a spinning wheel in order to make yarn. This work was normally done by unmarried women. And the term spinster was even used in legal documents up until the 20th century. You see, prior to the Industrial Revolution, women rarely worked outside the home and did not earn money. Then these women worked in factories and had some level of autonomy. Eventually, it became a bit of an insult to refer to a woman as a spinster. Until they were older than 26, then they were a thornback. Although that term is mostly dropped out of usage. Anyway, thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.